Hello, everybody. This is Tosca here at NGO Soul and Strategy. When you ask somebody in civil society or in international development these days about feminist leadership, the name Srilatha Batliwala comes up very quickly. People know Srilatha as the embodiment of the concept of feminist leadership. So I'm very pleased to have Srilatha with me on the show today. Welcome, Srilatha.
Thank you, Tosca. Happy to be here.
It's my absolute pleasure. So before I offer a proper introduction to Srilatha's body of work, there's a bit about feminist leadership that I just wanted to share. And if you want to learn more about the overall concept, in an earlier episode with Abby Maxman of Oxfam America, I offered a longer introduction on the background to feminist leadership as a leadership model. But for now, a short introduction. So, and this is really shorthand, feminist leadership typically falls within the realm of models of transformational leadership, which is a school of leadership thinking which, in a nutshell, emphasizes the ability of leaders to motivate their organizational employees to find intrinsic meaning in their work. So we're talking about a form of leadership that generates a willingness and energy among staff to go over and beyond what a job requires of them. And in international development and in INGOs, feminist leadership has been on the rise in the last 5 years or so. So in this podcast series, I want to interrogate a little bit why feminist leadership is on the rise as a desired leadership model. What are its strengths, but also what are its trade-offs? Because after all, we tend to be a little bit faddish in the INGO community. We tend to kind of imitate each other and go after certain models for a while. And maybe it's good to look at that a little bit more closely. So externally, of course, feminist leadership is focused on creating a gender-just world. But in this series, I want to primarily focus on how feminist leadership shows up inside organizations, especially in the social change sector. And that is what I primarily want to talk with Srilatha today about. So let us talk a little bit about your bio, Srilatha. You are a senior advisor in both the area of knowledge building and feminist leadership at CREA. And CREA stands for Creating Resources for Empowerment in Action. And you have a similar senior advisor role in Gender at Work. Now, CREA is a feminist human rights organization in India. And it's one of the very few international women's rights organizations based in the global south, led by Southern feminists. CREA builds feminist leadership capacities, advances women's human rights, and also expands sexual and reproductive freedoms. And interestingly enough, it also works on the nexus with the fight for LGBTI rights. Srilatha is the co-chair of the board for Just Associates, as well as for Gender at Work. She is a member of the International Advisory Board for the Institute for Human Rights and Business. And when I first came across Srilatha's work, she was a civil society research fellow at the Hauser Center at Harvard University here in the States, where she, together with Alnur Ibrahim and David Brown, wrote a widely cited article on the governance architecture in INGOs. So Srilatha, that's a whole body of work that we're going to talk to you about. So let's first talk a little bit to me, please, about CREA and how CREA came to this body of work on feminist leadership and your role in that.
Sure. I always find it hard to describe CREA because it's a very sort of interesting and unusual organization. It's always on the cutting edge because it has never really limited itself to a particular thematic focus or a single objective or goal, you know. Its identity is very strongly that it's a feminist organization, but it's a feminist organization that focuses on those it deems as having been excluded or marginalized even by feminist movements. So they have a very intersectional approach. So they have focused, for instance, their priority constituencies are, for instance, trans women, sex workers. As you know, sex work has been a very divisive issue in the women's movement.
Yes.
Women with disabilities and young women. So right from its inception, CREA was committed to supporting the building of younger women's leadership. Now, of course, that has expanded to support young feminist leadership, which is not the same thing, because it's about building leadership among, trans women, for instance, intersex people, etc. And the reason they focused on that so strongly right from its inception, which was actually 20 years ago, was that they felt that the whole focus in the women's movement was ending up not examining its own sustainability, and that there wasn't enough space and sort of opportunity for younger women to come into leadership. And therefore that the whole movement is kind of aging out. And that you need to create very conscious processes of not only building this leadership, but also ensuring that new waves of leadership access the history of the older movement. Because much of that is not, recorded or written down anywhere. Right. The second big leap that they made in both their feminist leadership training as well as their gender, sexuality, and rights training, which is also an extremely cutting edge program that CREA has developed, and it's world famous now. It's probably the most cutting edge institute on gender and sexuality, because, for instance, it ruptures the idea that gender and sexuality are one and the same thing. It shows that the way power structures operate in constructing and policing sexuality is not exactly the same as the power structures that construct and police gender roles, you see. So they really disrupt a lot of the sort of mainstream understanding of these concepts. And finally, I'll say a word about their pedagogy, which is, to me, the most important aspect of what CREA does in its leadership building work. If you look at all the sort of leadership training modules that existed, say 15 years ago, they were very instrumental. It was all about how to, how do I build a proposal? How do I do resource mobilization? How do I manage my organization? How do I create a strategic plan? So it's all about how to. CREA focuses on why. What is the purpose? And it busts this idea that activists don't want to learn theory and they can't grasp theory. So keep it simple, stupid, because they're activists. And in fact, it says that you can't act differently if you don't think differently. And if you have to think differently, you need to access the latest thinking, the latest, conceptual frameworks, the tools of analysis. You have to be a political thinker, and only then you can be a political actor.
Interesting.
So in our institutes, our pedagogy focuses on you understanding core concepts like power. How do you break down and understand power and how it operates in society? Core concepts like sexuality, core concepts like gender. The idea that heterosexuality is a construct, just like gender is, for example. The idea that patriarchy is not historical inevitability, that it's a very recent form of social organization. I teach a module called The Rise of Patriarchy, and they are blown away to discover this thing is only 10,000 years old. And before that, all societies were matrilinear, you know. So we go to concepts, we go to analysis, we go to new thinking, and we try to shift the way people are thinking about and looking at issues, because we know and we've seen that then shifts how they act.
Yeah. Very interesting, right?
So that's
right off the
about
bat.
CREA.
Right. You need to excuse me one moment. My pen ran out and I do want to make a few notes. 1 second, please.
Sure.
Sorry about that. So my second question is very much, I think we should first talk a little bit about how you have conceptualized power, and particularly social power. So how it works in society, social power that is, and I'm also obviously interested in how it works within organizations. So tell us a little bit about social power.
Well, first of all, I want to be very clear that this is not my conceptualization.
Okay.
I am very, very indebted to the work of Aruna Rao and David Kelleher and Gender at Work, as well as the work of my wonderful colleagues from Just Associate, Valerie Miller and Lisa Venner-Klassen, their work in their, really benchmark book, People, Power and Politics, and the work of, older political scientists and philosophers like Foucault and many others, and the work that's come out of Ideas Sussex. So I love this very simple definition of power that Aruna and David developed, which is, and I added something to it by drawing from Foucault. So they defined power, social power, as who gets what, the distribution of resources, who does what, the distribution of labor, and who decides what. So it's about decision-making, power, and control. And to this, I added who frames the agenda. Because I think what Foucault taught us is that, particularly in modern societies, the power to frame the agenda, to decide what gets discussed, for example, to decide what's on the front page of the newspaper and what is on page 7, yeah, or what's in the headlines in the TV news and what isn't. That's a huge source of power, deciding what will be discussed, what's important. Framing people's thinking is
right
really about this. Right. So this is the agenda setting power. So this is a definition of power that I find works very well. And then I draw a lot, for instance, on the work of Lisa and Valerie in looking at the 3 spaces in which power operates. So we all tend to, especially in the NGO sector, and in social movements, we've tended to focus a lot on shifting power in visible public spaces, public institutions, changing policies, changing laws, so those kind of public institutions of government, police, army, courts, etc. This is what we've tended to focus on.
Yeah.
But I think the power of feminist analysis of power has really brought to our awareness the concept of the private spaces in which power operates, and how often our access to power in the public space is determined by our power in the private space. So this is, how power operates in very intimate spaces like the family, inside marriage, in clans and other traditional, community settings. This is a very important space in which power operates. And you only understand this when you look at it through a gender lens, because that's when you see that women women's access to power is first controlled here.
Right.
And so you can make all the great laws that you want. You can give all the quotas that you like, for women to get elected or get jobs or whatever. But if this family space, for instance, or the marital space is controlling her access, her decision-making power, her choices, and her labor, how can she access those?
Yeah.
And then I think they made us aware, of course, that we shouldn't look at power as always something external. And this is, again, for me, is a very feminist way of looking at power, is the power within the self. That's
and
also
how we think about
huge,
self.
So, and that's how we think about the self and what we believe we can do. And here I always think of my grandmother, because this explains the phenomenon of why sometimes the poorest people, the poorest women who seem most oppressed, most excluded, most marginalized, but yet they have the self-esteem, they have the confidence, they have the agency, as we like to say in the Ingo world, to go out there and challenge everything. And that's what my grandmother did. She had nothing in terms of material assets or much of a voice in the family, but she raised me as a feminist. And she believed in her power, in her internal power, and she used it to make a lot of, move a lot of mountains in her life. So I think the key thing that I'll close with is that, the work of Fenn-Klassen and Miller and others has made us realize that we can't just focus on visible power. We have, as feminists and as leaders, we have to look at how power operates in hidden ways, and most importantly, in invisible ways.
Yes.
And I'll say more about that when we talk about organizations and power.
Oh, super, super. So interesting. And we were both smiling when you talked about your grandmother. This is not visible, of course, to a podcast listener, but it made me happy to imagine her. Now, you have... are there parallels, Srilatha, in how you just described that social power shows up in society and how it shows up within organizations? Can you give some examples maybe of those parallels?
Well, a simple example is the way visible and hidden power operate in organizations. Visible power is, what is the clear, transparent sort of hierarchy or structure, of the hierarchy. Who does what, who has what kind of decision-making power, who controls the resources and the sort of decision-making. So you have that very transparent hierarchy. But the truth is, as we all know and as we've all experienced, there are several hidden ways in which power actually operates in organizations, which often has little to do with the way it is formally set up.
Yes.
So I'll give you a very simple example of perhaps somebody who is the executive assistant to the director of the organization. Okay. So in the hierarchy, this is quite it's an important role, but it's not a kind of role with a lot of visible power, right? You're just the executive assistant. But I know of case after case where this executive assistant has been around for a lot longer than the director.
Yeah.
Okay. It's like I've seen directors come and go, my dear, for many years.
Yeah.
And that is the guy or the woman who knows how to operate that system.
Yeah.
And they also know how to manipulate the director.
Yes.
Okay. So that is part of what you call the deep structure or the hidden structure of the organization. You have a policy. I'll give another example of zero tolerance of sexual harassment, excellent, grievance mechanism that's set up. And then when you go and examine how that mechanism works, you discover that there are built-in ways in which hidden power is operating. For example, the person reporting sexual harassment has to first report to their supervisor.
Yeah.
What if the supervisor is the person harassing you?
Mm-hmm.
There is no mechanism created for dealing with this,
Mm-hmm.
you know? So that's where the formal policy and the formal structure and the informal ways in which that structure is being manipulated or, used to protect the hierarchy of power there is very different. So these are just two concrete examples.
And I love that. I was actually going to ask you a question about the work on deep structure that Aruna, David, you and others have developed in it, because I love using that in my work on senior leadership training. So let me go right there. So you told us a little bit how you analyze some facets of deep structure organizations. And just for our audience, I can, from a slide that I have used in your work, some other examples of deep structures is the actual versus the stated work norms, right? So we say we are about one particular norm, but actually some other behaviors are more rewarded. Things like spreading rumors, etc., that are a way of exerting power. Informal groups and cliques, you already referred to that, and unstated personal biases. These are all examples of these deep structures.
Now, and not just biases, Tosca, if I can interrupt.
Sure.
I've realized now more recently in the last couple of years with all the stuff that's come out about embedded racism and sexism inside organizations, it's also the embedded sense of privilege. So it's biases and internalized privilege.
Yes, internalized privilege. Yeah, well said. So we can analyze these forms of deep structures and expressions of social power in organization. But what can a feminist leader do to maneuver around them or to engage with them in a way not in a way of getting beyond them as an organization? What can we do to not just analyze, but also maneuver politically within these deep structures in order to get the work done that the feminist leader cares about?
Well, I think we wrote quite a lot about this in the Feminist Leadership Toolkit, which Michelle Friedman from Gender Work and I did, and that's also available on the CREA website.
So we'll reference that in the show notes.
Yeah. I think just to, put it sort of succinctly and more simply, a feminist leader deals with deep structure by bringing it to the surface.
Okay.
See, the power of deep structure is as long as it remains hidden, unnamed, unrecognized, and unaddressed. That's how it thrives. Now, as long as we are human beings and not pre-programmed robots who build organizations, deep structure is always going to exist. The point is, how deep will you let it be? How murky, how ugly, how destructive will you let it become? I think the point is that a feminist leader recognizes its existence. It doesn't matter whether it's a man, woman, trans, intersex person who is the leader. If they are feminist leaders, they will first of all recognize its existence. And they will put in motion mechanisms to bring them to the surface. There are several of these. One simple mechanism is, of course, the 360-degree assessments. Okay. 360-degree assessments always bring to the surface a lot of deep structure dynamics, and then nobody deals with them. So that's a different story. Okay. Two, I think you have to build into your annual cycle an organizational culture environment survey.
I see.
When I worked with AVID, we used to have this survey done every 2 years by an external agency, with competency in doing this.
Yeah.
And that helped the organization assess the quality of the working environment inside. They would ask us simple things like, when you wake up in the morning and it's a working day, do you think, oh no, I have to go to work? Right. Or do you say, yes, today I'm going to do X, Y, Z? Therein hangs a tale. Okay. So assessing the quality of the internal environment is hugely important. And that's what a feminist leader will prioritize. The fact is that today, especially in the Ingo world, everybody is driven by targets, by project deadlines, by deliverables, by results. And you go out in the world with all this wonderful rhetoric about social justice and equality and transformation, and your inside sucks. Your inside system is actually full of pathology. Maybe I'm exaggerating to make a point.
No, it's all right.
So a feminist leader understands that the feminist transformation has to begin there. Because I have a very simple motto. If I say another world is possible, but I cannot enable people to experience that other world in this small little space of the organization, why should they believe it's possible in larger society? They won't. So making it visible. And the third thing they will do is to make people accountable, especially people in positions of formal authority. Make them accountable for the quality of the working environment. There are more than enough tools in the human resource management toolbox to do all of this.
Yeah.
And finally, I would say they need to initiate interesting and innovative new systems and not just rely on the good old ways of doing things. I myself did a lot of experiments of this kind. For instance, how a feminist leader is interested in how power is shared and used within the organization, not just outside. Yeah. So one form of power, for instance, is who designs budgets, who determines what the project deliverables are, etc. So the minute you start opening up those processes and making them more participatory, to use a very sad, tired, old word, but still a meaningful one, and you start making entire teams accountable for the deliverables. That's one. I did a simple experiment. I said, all cleaning tasks in the organization will go by rotation. So I was the executive director, and I had my once every 10 days duty of cleaning the office, both in the morning and at the end of the day. I introduced something very radical in our culture, which is everybody had to wash their own dishes and plates. Otherwise, there's always some poor oppressed woman who's employed to do that menial job. I reversed the way leave is sanctioned. When you take leave or take vacation time, it's not your supervisor who will sanction your leave. It's the people who will be affected by your absence who will sanction your leave.
So you purposely turn power on its head.
Reverse, exactly.
Interesting.
And these were experiments. We didn't have any individual leadership. We always had collective leadership of our teams. So you just start, dispersing power, including my own. Like, what are the things that I could decide about without
Yeah.
consulting anybody? Was practically nothing.
Yeah. Yeah.
But
Yeah.
we set up those policies together. We created them together. We analyzed them together. We decided what worked and what wasn't, and
Right.
we changed.
So you experimented with these turning things upside down, and then you reviewed together what that did to the organization, and they decided how to go forward with that. So let me ask you two more questions. One is that I could imagine there are situations where there's a tension between what an organizational leader in a civil society organization, what types of leadership model they have in their head coming from their national culture. So whether that is Dutch culture, I'm from the Netherlands originally, whether that's American culture, Indian culture, whatever, that there are tensions between what expectations about leadership behaviors come from national culture and what is expected from a feminist leader once an organization has officially adopted feminist leadership as a model, if you will, as a framework. Have you seen those tensions show up? And talk to me, will you please, about how should we resolve that?
Well, again, of course, these tensions arise. I can give several examples in my own experience. The classic thing in South Asian culture is the reproduction of familial relationships and familial hierarchies in the workspace. And of course, caste hierarchies, familial and caste hierarchies in the workplace, okay? So the people in formal authority are the upper castes and, should not be questioned. And they don't do the dirty work either. And then, down the caste hierarchy, get less and less voice, less and less power, less and less right to question. A culture in which questioning, especially of those in authority, those higher up in the hierarchy, is simply not acceptable. That's considered, extremely not just. It's like it's violating the cultural norm. If they are senior, they must be wiser. They know more than you. If they're older, they are wiser. They know more than you. This age hierarchy intersecting with caste and gender hierarchy and class hierarchy, it's a mess. Yeah. So all the time, I was told by my team in the women's empowerment program that I headed, from which a lot of my examples come, but you are our mother. You must look after us. You must tell us what to do. You must forgive us when we make mistakes. Like, I disappeared. I didn't go to the field for 15 days. The grassroots women were just coming to meetings and going home, and I never showed up. You must forgive me because you're my mother. I made a mistake. So I worked very hard to break that imagery and that cultural expectation that I should be the parent, and therefore they can behave like children and be naughty. And I had to set up accountability systems, and there, sadly, I had to use my hierarchical power in a very top-down way.
Yeah.
And that troubled me, but I justified it to myself, saying I'm doing it for this better end, to achieve a justifiable end. I say, no, from now on, you are accountable to the grassroots women, not to me. I don't care whether you show up or you don't show up. And if I get consistently 3 complaints from them that you're not showing up, you're not doing your work at the community level, sorry, you have to go. And if I do it, if I fail in my response, I used to initiate an annual assessment of my performance by my team, and it was a big struggle to shift that culture. So I think the key is, and for me, okay, let me give another example. The grassroots women, when they were collectivized and, this huge movement was built, largely oppressed caste women and indigenous women. And the idol worship culture is very strong, right? So they asked me very innocently one day, the women are asking for a photograph of you. Luckily, my feminist antenna was very sharp, and I said, why? What do they want to photograph for? This is in the days before smartphones and all that, right? You actually needed a camera to take a photograph. I said, why do they want a photograph? Oh, because they want to put a picture of you in their meeting hall.
Yeah.
And I said, no. Why do they want to put a picture? Oh, because they feel you are the reason that they have gained so much. I said, no, they are the reason that they have gained. It's their power. It's their getting organized. So I will issue cameras to each district office. You will take photographs of the women of each village collected, and that photograph will be put in the meeting center.
Because the symbolism is so important.
This is it. So you
interesting.
have to be constantly vigilant, because it was so easy for me to succumb.
Yeah.
And many, I'm sad to say, many so-called feminist leaders do succumb, because this cultural dimension is so deeply embedded, it's so uninterrogated, that they think feminist politics is about pro-choice or anti-choice, or about,
external
abortion rights, or, equal inheritance laws. They don't think it's about how they are conducting themselves, or how people within the organization conduct themselves, or how they use their power, and how they enable others to use or misuse their power. I'm sorry, that was a very long answer to a
it's all right
question.
it's very interesting, because it ultimately gets also to the ego, I think. But let me move to my last question, because we're almost out of time. So it's actually kind of not going back to basics, but it is my observation, at least anecdotally, that early on, when I observed some INGOs who wanted to introduce feminist leadership, there was actually quite a bit of confusion within the organization amongst managers and leaders about the distinction between women in development and in development programming, gender and leadership, and feminist leadership. So tell us a little bit about the distinctions between those three. Where are they distinct and where do they overlap?
Well, first of all, it saddens me to have to even explain this, because to me, it's a sign of exactly why CREA focuses so much on conceptual clarity in our trainings. Because this, to me, displays a lack of conceptual clarity.
Yes, it is.
At a very deep level, okay? What is development is totally different from what is gender, is totally different from what is feminism.
But particularly, I noticed some sustained confusion on the difference between women in development, right? Or women and power and poverty, for instance. 1, 2, gender and leadership, and 3, feminist leadership. Those 3 were confused. Have you observed that early on?
I think I can address this quite simply and in a very straightforward way. I think it's because of a very strong but natural confusion that occurred because of the big push, especially, in the 80s and 90s, to get women into leadership. That is, biological women into leadership, okay? Which really had, yes, it was a feminist agenda, because out of a simple of simple principle of equality and equity, there was a call for having equal representation in, say, for instance, political bodies or key decision-making bodies of women, because they had been totally excluded from these spaces. And I think that has created this confusion because there is confusion around, so I don't even know what gender leadership means. I have no idea what they're talking about, so I can't address that. But I can tell you that it's the confusion is about the concept that somehow feminist leadership is about women in leadership. Or it's about interrogating the gender parity in leadership. So maybe that's what they mean by gender leadership. Because, it's like when people say gender empowerment, I want to scream and say, so you want to empower gender, make more gender differ? What the hell are you talking about, So I think this is where the confusion has come. It's about getting more women into positions of leadership. And then it's about advancing gender equality through leadership, leadership sort of embracing the idea of advancing gender equality. But feminist leadership is totally different, because feminist leadership is no more about women than being a socialist or a pro-Marxist or pro-Gandhian is about being male. See, as I always tell my participants, feminist leadership, feminism is an ideology. It's a social change strategy. And it is about opening the door and examining power in all the hidden spaces where it has been. So it is an ideology, but it's more importantly, it's a social change approach or methodology that goes deeper than any other. It doesn't stop at the door. It opens the door. It goes inside. It looks at all forms of exclusion. So a feminist leadership is about advancing a feminist vision of social justice.
Right.
You don't need particular sexual organs to do that. You get it?
Yes.
I can be a cis male, an intersex person, a cis female, a trans man or woman, and I can be a feminist leader because it's about that vision of change, and it's about those values and principles in the way I lead.
In the way I lead.
In the way I lead. It's about sharing power, practicing those values, and practicing that politics in every space that I occupy, private or public.
Yeah.
Personal is political. Good old feminist proverb.
Still relevant.
And so I would say that the biggest myth of all is the one that says, I'll conclude with this, that because I lead a feminist organization, I'm a feminist leader. No. Or because I lead a social justice organization, I'm a socially just leader. No, it's not that simple.
I like that very much. That is a good myth to debunk at the very end of this interview. Well, thank you so much, Srilatha, for all your insights. Super interesting. And thank you, listeners. If you found this podcast stimulating, then please help other social sector leaders find my podcast by leaving a review on your favorite podcast platform. Also, if you're interested in exploring more of the leadership models, including feminist leadership, as well as others, we have a chapter in our book, Between Power and Irrelevance, The Future of Transnational NGOs, that was just published last year, that has that chapter about our observations on leadership and leadership development in the INGO sector, including some significant leadership blind spots as we see them. You can find more information about our book, as well as the other work that I spearhead on fiveoaksconsulting.org. Thank you again, Srilatha. This is Tosca, And I look forward to spending time with you on NGO, Soul, and Strategy next time.